Hi, I'm Chad. This video is on NATO and it's the threats the organization faces and what they can do to deter these threats. Um, First off, NATO is an organization whose enduring purpose is to safeguard the freedom and security of its members by political and military means. Um, they want to promote democracy and human rights and sovereignty through um, three core tasks: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. Collective defense is the idea that they'll consider an attack on one member country an attack on all of them. So that's emphasized in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. That was only used once during the September 11 attack, so they're obviously careful not to use that too much. And then there's also crisis management, where they just want to have the ability politically and militarily to handle crises around the world before and after they happen. Um, and there's also cooperative security, where they will look to cooperate with other non-members countries and international organizations to achieve their goal. So the threats facing NATO in terms of states directly threatening the organization and its member countries, Russia is the main and really only threat that they have their focus on. They mentioned China and North Korea, of course, is a threat with their nuclear threats, but Russia is a country that considers NATO a threat to its national security. So Russia is really definitely the biggest and main threat NATO sees um, to the member countries as an organization. And then after that, it's really just a lot of other smaller threats, like terrorism. Of course, that's after the 9/11 attacks. NATO is focused on deterring more terrorist attacks and terrorism in general. Um, but then there's other things like shrinking in democracy around the world. Um, and then also climate change is briefly mentioned. And then I'm going to also talk about the idea of burden sharing being a problem, because Donald Trump has often talked about that and there's controversy around that. So that's another thing that I'll talk about. But in terms of Russia and the threats they are showing towards NATO, um, right now the military capabilities is behind in technology, so conventional threat for them for most countries is not likely. Um, the NATO documents say that the Euro-Atlantic area is at relative peace right now, so they're not worried in that sense. What worries them about Russia is the political attacks, what they often refer to as hybrid attacks, where they have electronic attacks and where they try to cause political disarray in a country, and also just conventional political conventional attacks where they like Crimea, for example, and where they actually do bring the military in. But a lot of the threats we do face are electronic ones, where they just try to do whatever they can with misinformation campaigns and hurting election outcomes, and just trying to make policies in other countries go their way through whatever means necessary. So that's the main threat that they face. But also, there's also the nuclear threat. Um, a lot of people think of North Korea as a big nuclear threat, but Russia has also been a huge threat to NATO, because Russia sees nuclear warfare as a consistent and strategic part of war with NATO, meaning they see war with NATO involving um, nuclear weapons like throughout the war, not maybe just at the very beginning of the end. Um, they it's believed that they see it as a consistent part of the war, where there would be there's strategic placings on their part, where um, it would definitely not be a one and done thing. It sounds like so. That's definitely really concerning. So yeah, in terms of trying to prevent these things, in terms of the annexation of Crimea, and um, they have also um, um, had issues with countries in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova with going against international law, and they have done something in terms of their sovereignty in those other countries. Um, but that's another problem where NATO can't do much, and as long as they're not a member country, so militarily, so they NATO calls for implementation of Minsk agreements, um, and supports efforts in the more Normandy format, where these are just efforts that will call for more sanctions and more diplomatic um, measures on NATO's part. So their hands are kind of tied when Russia does those types of things. But when it comes to the nuclear weapons, some people argue that the um, the kind of disarmament of European countries after World War II has been a mistake, as those countries um, now seem to just not pose enough of a threat to Russia to really stop them from building up their nuclear arsenal. Uh, an article from the Atlantic Council where this guy argues that basically NATO has not reached military capacity to ensure winning the war against Russia, is his bottom line. Obviously, like I've said, they're way behind in technology and like a lot of everyday, war, typical war um, equipment and stuff like that. But the nuclear arms, they see it as a big part of, if they do go to war, they see nuclear arms and ballistic missiles and whatnot as a huge part of the strategy. So some suggest that NATO basically needs to bulk up the military and presence in Europe, and they didn't necessarily say increase the amount of nuclear arms um, in Europe or in NATO um, as a policy. It was kind of careful in those in word choice, but it was definitely saying that Russia has not gotten the message, has not been deterred by the nuclear threat of NATO. So it sounds like he needs. Some people suggest that NATO needs to make it more clear to Russia that they are not they're not messing around basically when it comes to military and their willingness to use it, and even to use nuclear weapons. So that's very interesting. Um, but yeah, that's it. Basically, it for Russia. It's really tough for NATO when they say they want to do deterrence through peace and through the lowest force possible. When that's kind of almost what Russia seems to be using to their advantage. That they don't want to use military. Of course, I'm not saying that would be a good idea to use military, but it just seems like Russia's really just doing a good job of playing a political game to try to get their way. But anyway, as I said, another threat to NATO is um, the decline in democracies around the world. Turkey, Poland, and Hungary have steered away from democracy recently. Um, every one of these countries saw, an election of a leader from one dominant party, and there were restructures throughout the laws. Turkey cracked down on civil liberties and centralized power to the president, and it's a lot of things that it's almost like things we were kind of afraid of here in the United States, where these were people who took power lawfully through elections that then when once in power, they use the laws to go their way, and now they um, they have lost their democracy status. So that's a huge problem to NATO, and of course, there's not much they can do militarily. They try to use diplomatic resources to try to swing these countries a certain way, but it's obviously not easy. Um, then terrorism, of course, is a threat, and but like I said, that's a very since 2001, that's just always going to be a threat. It seems. Um, and yes, but what was interesting was that NATO did mention the tours in Afghanistan as a place for lessons to be learned. So it seems like they are kind of aware that um, what they did in Afghanistan were trying, and even Iraq maybe, was where they didn't take a lot of political and social things into account. So I think that's something that NATO has kind of gotten a hold of, where using military to try to help these countries and just get rid of the the people who are threatening people with these terrorist groups or whatnot. That there's a lot of other political and economic things that go into it as well. So I think the regime change um, strategy that we did in Afghanistan and in Iraq is something that NATO is trying to stay away from. Hopefully, um, like I said, um, in terms of the amount of time that NATO spends on things, Russia took a huge bulk of it, of everything, in terms of threat assessments. And then it would just seem like climate change would kind of be at the very end. It would get like a quick mention in all their documents. And this honestly felt a little political to me, if anything. That just was, it's very basic statements where, in 2010 summit, the Secretary General said NATO must help to curb climate change. But other than that, there's not a whole lot of mention of it. Articles say that there's a question of whether NATO should fight something like that, because of course it's not a military or political entity. It's and even it's something that NATO is not really in position to control, really. And even NATO themselves have said in documents that those are other international organizations that help that issue. So it seems like on NATO's end, climate change is not going to be a big enemy, really, so to speak, for them. So I think that's something that's very important. That would mean a lot to some people. But also in terms of this burden sharing debate, what Trump talks about, where the United States is paying too much and all these other countries not enough. Well, it's interesting because over the past 5 years, European allies and Canada have increased their burden sharing. So that is something that NATO has focused on recently. They've also stepped up military exercises across Europe. But like I said, some people think, even with these increases, it's still not enough, and evidently Russia does not feel deterred by these exercises and whatnot. But yeah, so that's essentially it. Some other issues are other things that make it difficult to solve all these issues are threat assessments. I mean, member countries are going to take different countries seriously based on where they are. Middle East countries aren't going to be as worried about Russia as the European countries closer to them. So that's an issue that NATO wants to try to look to solve. But in the end, it seems that they had a 2020 summit literally a week ago. It was a 2030 summit, I guess. Summit to plan the 2030 summit. And once again, it was all about they recommend strengthening deterrence and defense. And they also mentioned that these strategic concepts that I'm reading from are not a save-all. They're not the reason these problems exist. So there's always a lot of things to look at. Um, yeah, but it did say that three core tasks are essential that I mentioned being that those are still essential to the functioning. Um, but yeah, in terms of threats, it was all Russia. Um, and to fend off nuclear threats, including Russia, and including China too. So yeah, that's it. That's basically my video. What things that NATO has been dealing with as a threat and what they can hopefully try to do to solve them. Thank you.